Hi everyone, welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell. Our guest today is Chard deNiord. Chard is an acclaimed poet and author of 7 books of poetry. His writing, which includes poems, essays, and interviews with eminent poets, has appeared in many journals, anthologies, and even a motion picture. Chard held many teaching positions, including at Putney School, Providence College, and he co-created the MFA program at New England College. Chard was the Poet Laureate of Vermont from 2015 to 2019, and during that time, he created and produced the award-winning Poets Speak series right here on BCTV. Welcome, Chard.
Thank you, Wendy. Wonderful to be here.
It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks.
Yes, I'm used to seeing you on the other side of the camera, watching Poets Speak.
That's true.
Yeah, that was a wonderful series, by the way.
It was. I was really happy with, the way it just went from poet to poet throughout, mainly Vermont poets, almost exclusively Vermont poets. But it turned out to be really kind of an exhilarating show to find the great diversity of poets in Vermont and to talk to them for half an hour, just as you're doing here today.
Yeah.
I think it's really one of the richest states as far as its poetry tradition from Frost on up to the present in the country.
Why do you think it is?
I don't know, but it's interesting. There's a statistic about Vermont that there are more writers per capita in Vermont than any other state. And so when I asked people that, including poets, they used to say, it's because they leave us alone.
Oh.
They just feel like poets and writers feel like they can move to Vermont and just
interesting.
Live almost, in hiding here.
In seclusion if they need it.
Right.
I think I remember the show you did with Diana Whitney, who's a Brattleboro poet, lived in the Northern Kingdom, and you asked her if she missed it, and she said yes. What do you miss? The quiet. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of it.
Right.
And we'll get back to that because I think there's so many interesting things about the interviewing process as well. But you were born in New Haven.
I was.
And then you moved to Lynchburg, Virginia. Big difference.
Moved to Charlottesville first. My father was a surgeon, and he was doing his residency there. And then there was a great need for a thoracic surgeon in Lynchburg, so that's why he moved to Lynchburg. Although he'd never been really in the South before, and I ended up growing up there, Lynchburg, near the Blue Ridge Mountains.
It's beautiful, right?
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
When I was interviewing Ruth Stone, I asked her, well, why in the world did you move to Vermont, when you were a young woman? And she said, well, I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, and the mountains reminded me of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I went to a private school in Connecticut, a prep school called Kent School, and met my wife there my senior year. And we fell in love and got married a week after graduation.
Wow.
So we needed a place to go to college and live, and Lynchburg, where I grew up, was really the most supportive place. I went to Lynchburg College, and Liz went to Randolph-Macon. It's now Randolph College. And then we came back to New Haven after college, and I went to Yale Divinity School, and Liz went to Southern University, got her degree in education there. And I worked for several years, 5 years at the Connecticut Mental Health Center after graduating from Divinity School, because my bishop in Virginia, who had a wonderfully fictional name, Bishop Heath Light, told me that I shouldn't get ordained right away. I should work if I was going to become a minister or a priest, and doing anything, digging ditches, and so he said, you don't want to do funerals, weddings right away. You need life experience. So I was writing also at the time, but I worked at the Connecticut Mental Health Center, which was part of the Yale University Medical School, and worked on an inpatient unit and then an outpatient unit. And I applied to the Iowa Writers Workshop while I was there, my 5th year there, and got accepted, luckily. And I went to the head of the department there, the outpatient department, a guy named Stan Jackson, who was also a writer and just a wonderfully kind and insightful fellow. And I said, what should I do? I'm at this turning point. And he said, go. He just said, go. He didn't say get out of here, but he just said you need to do this.
The writer's
workshop. I said, but I have no money.
Yeah.
And he said, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So you'll find a way to survive.
And
so I did.
And you did.
Yeah, I got a TA, teaching assistant position, and Liz worked just, she sold, she probably doesn't want me to say this, but selling encyclopedias. We just did
Oh,
everything
wow.
we could
Yeah,
to
yeah.
just scrape by with 2 children at that point.
Oh, wow.
But I'm so happy we ended up doing it.
Yeah. And did you like Iowa?
I loved Iowa. Iowa City is just civic bliss. For me, it was civic bliss. It was the
Interesting.
first in the country in so many ways, as far as its libraries, as far as its, in Iowa City anyway, City Park, you know, they just really were visionary, I thought, in their kind of civic outlook towards just making parks accessible, libraries accessible,
Yeah.
the university accessible. So it was just a wonderful place for us to be.
Yeah, that's great. And I assume also very wholesome place to
Very,
have
very
kids.
wholesome. Very wholesome.
Yes.
It was. Yeah.
So, Chard, how did you get focused on religious studies?
Gee, that's a good question. My father, my grandparents, my great grandfather were all surgeons and doctors. And so there was this huge expectation for me to be a doctor. But I was getting B's and C pluses and pre-med courses at Lynchburg College. And I knew that if I was going to get into a good medical school, that I needed to do better than that. And I was also taking English and religious studies courses. And I loved the religious studies program at Lynchburg. It had one of the best departments in the country in religious studies. And I had 2 wonderful professors there named James Price and Pat Kelly, who just really encouraged me and finally advised me to go to graduate school. So that's what happened.
So you were in graduate school doing religious studies. Did poetry fit in somewhere here?
It did. I mean, I was writing, though, still writing sort of secretly the whole time, but, writing these pretty turgid, papers for my homiletics course or my biblical studies courses or whatever, theology. And I'll never forget, I had a wonderful homiletics professor, that's a preaching professor named Bill Meal, who was legendary there. And he said, after I gave one sermon, he said, "Chard, can I tell you something?" And I said, "Sure." "Yes, please." He says, he says, "Don't take this the wrong way, but your sermons are a little too poetic, and your poetry is a little too preachy." It was just what I needed to hear. As a young writer, you just need that kind of feedback. And so I just, why do you keep writing? Well, especially when there's no promise. I hadn't published anything. There's just some mysterious voice in you that just says, stupidly sometimes, I guess, keep writing.
Yes.
Keep writing.
Right. So many of us are introduced to poetry at a young age. And I was thinking of this today in relation to talking with you today. When did I first get interested in poetry? And, of course, the teenage years, especially for a girl in the 60s. There was that piece. So Edna St. Vincent Millay, and
God, yes.
E. Cummings and all those people. But then I realized, for all of us, pretty much across the board, we have poetry from the get-go. We have nursery rhymes. We have song, mothers singing to us.
No, I know. I'm glad you bring this up because Americans have such a strange, mysterious, even relationship with poetry. A lot of America has such a utilitarian tradition, in business and invention, and in politics, of course. So there are not a ton of people who read poetry. I think the last NEA statistic was only 10% of Americans read poetry or even literary fiction. While in, say, South America, everybody reads poetry.
Yeah.
It's even on the currency.
Interesting,
For instance, in Brazil, there's this wonderful poet named Carlos Drummond Andrade. One of his lines is on there, on the dollar bill there, that says, "I write to let children sleep and wake up adults." It's loose translation.
That's beautiful.
I knew this was not going to be a lucrative profession for me, but again, it was something that I just had to do, and I look back and I realized, well, I always sort of had to do this for reasons that I can't fully explain.
Yes. On the other side of that coin is the fact that poetry arises for us like at weddings and funerals and all of these different places.
Thank you. And it's ingrained in our politics. Think about it. The Declaration of Independence.
Right.
It's a prose poem. You know, I hold these truths to be self-evident. And then the list of those truths, you
Yes.
know, and this
And the cadence.
the cadence of
Yeah.
it. And where else? The Gettysburg Address. So two documents that without those documents, that poetry,
Yeah.
where would this country be
Yeah.
right now?
Yeah.
You know, they moved every American to a point where they, you know, were just a little bit more awake after hearing those, in so many ways.
Yes.
Those prose poems.
And it's very ephemeral feeling, too, that one gets from that. But even inaugurations, right?
Oh,
There's
yeah.
always a poet.
Absolutely. Oh, well, Trump didn't have one, but everybody
true?
else did. So that says a lot to me.
Yes, I think so. Chard, at some point you started teaching.
Yeah. After Iowa, I didn't know what my profession was going. I was in my 30s. It was late not to know what my profession was going, especially with two children. And so I applied to a few teaching jobs at the secondary level around the country. And fortunately, this guy called me up from the Gunnery School in Connecticut.
Oh, yeah.
And said, we'll interview you. And could you come? And so I just got on my fastest horse, out there from
Which
Iowa.
probably was a Volkswagen something, right?
It was. In fact, it was the Volkswagen Rabbit. Anyway, I just so luckily got that job and worked there for 4 years, and then I could tell a little story why I left there, but it's a kind of fascinating little story. The students wanted me to support them during Martin Luther King Day. And the headmaster did not want to observe it. Oh. And so I did support the students. I was sort of the unofficial chaplain there.
Uh-huh.
And at the end of the day, with all these teachers who came out, residents from Washington, Connecticut, came in and talked to the students about Frederick Gunn, who was a really famous abolitionist and a friend of Henry Beecher, who lived in the area, and so forth. And so there's a rich history there. But at the end of the day, the headmaster called me and said, "You're fired. You're fired." So I said, because he didn't want to observe Martin Luther King Day. So I said, "Okay, bye. I don't think I want to be here anymore either." So I needed a job, and I think back on my life and just how lucky I've been. Putney School was looking for a person. An alumna had just created a position, an endowed position in comparative religions and philosophy. And so I called up Barbara Barnes at the Putney School, and she said, "Well, I'll meet you at a Burger King. And I'm on an alumni trip in such and such a little town. I can't remember where it was." And so I read the history of the Putney School backwards, Susan Lloyd's book, and I met her there. And I think I knew more about the history of Putney than she did by the time I got there, although she knew a lot. At any rate, she said, "Well, I'll invite you to the school." Make a long story short, so I got the job at the Putney School and loved living there for 10 years, and before I got the job at Providence College.
And so you were teaching religious studies pretty much during this time.
But comparative religions. So I was teaching sort of a lot of Joseph Campbell, for instance.
Yes.
And I was teaching a lot of philosophy in my own curriculum.
Could you talk a little bit about that, I'm sorry to use the word interface, but
That's okay.
the connection for you between religion and poetry?
That's a good question.
Well, how they inform each other, perhaps.
Yeah. That's a terrific question. I mean, they both ask huge questions. And I just have always been obsessed with huge questions, but not in a way that I would call a serious thinking problem, because that could get very boring and, and insular. That's another. So it was religious studies and poetry both that I guess I became obsessed with, and there were Bible stories that it just it stayed with me forever, and the poetry in the Bible, from Job to the Proverbs to Ecclesiastes, which is actually my favorite book, and to all of this just enthralled me, and so I, to this day, continue to be enthralled with those stories. I don't want to say religion per se, but it's the stories and the tradition behind the stories and the literature behind the stories. and then the poetry that became, just as secular as it did religious in my work.
Well, I feel like there's an inquiry inherent in both of those. Whether you're studying it or reading it, I think that
Yeah.
there aren't necessarily any answers.
No. There's a wonderful line in Ecclesiastes too that I keep going back to, which is also just as secular in many ways as it is religious. That God has put eternity into the hearts and minds of human beings, but so they will never figure out what's happened from beginning to end.
Chard, along with all of your teaching and along with all of your writing, as you've gone along all these years, you've received a lot of accolades and a lot of recognition, which is not necessarily likely for a poet.
Yeah, right. And then after you get it, it's still, it's like a feather dropping into the Grand Canyon and waiting to hear the echo a little bit. As Robert Frost said about publishing a book of poetry.
That's beautiful. Yeah. That's a great quote. But you've been a visiting chair, you've been a fellow, you've been a scholar at Brattleboro. Recently you were named a fellow of Vermont's Academy of Arts and Sciences. You won a Pushcart Prize. You were Poet Laureate for 4 years. I mean, these are things that, there are so many people, writing poems and having reams of poetry. So do you see, I sort of hesitate to ask you if you see an arc to your career, but do you feel, looking back at it now, as we are wont to do at our age, looking back at our lives, do you see a thread, or do you see, even like a color that goes through your life?
It's really curious, because I wake up every morning thinking about the next poem. And sometimes I can't think of the next poem at all, and so that's the thread. It's the writing is the thread, and what really keeps me alive emotionally and spiritually and creatively. I feel now, you mentioned our age, we're pretty close in age, that I am curious about poems I've written earlier, even 50 years ago now, that I can't, and then I go back and read and don't feel that I, was that person now. I mean, it's shocking. So the more I've written over the years, the more I realize that the more other I feel, like a stranger even to myself, the better. The more profound and the more moving it is to me that when I read a poem that and I've noticed that in the interviews that I've done with all these poets too, that it's that phenomenon of the other, crossing over to that other, and feeling enormously grateful that voice, wherever it came from, it's me, but it's not me either. So
I think so many creative people and people in general talk about that when you are really kind of in love with what you're doing in your expression, especially your creative expression, that you lose a sense of self.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great kind of cleansing, and at the same time, ironically, paradoxically, affirming, and I don't know how else to describe it. Is part of the creative process. I think people will talk about the muse all the time, and that's just a kind of proverbial way of talking about this other. But the older I get, the more I realize that the voice, the language. I just wrote a long poem that was in the Paris Review a few months ago about Gilgamesh. I said, all right, there's Gilgamesh in Enkidu talking to me. All right, here's what they said.
So interesting.
So it happens historically as well as presently.
I would imagine that you're going back to sort of things along the way that are kind of either classical or embedded with a certain kind of...
absolutely. And the more, we were talking about my religious studies background, that's all classical.
Right.
And I took 6 years of Latin and, and 4 years of Russian, and so all that helped tremendously.
Yeah, language.
And it comes in unconsciously,
It's so interesting, because you're thinking a little bit differently in each language, I would think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Chard, you did a couple of great series on interviews with other writers, with other poets.
I did.
Yes.
I did. I started with this book. I knew that these poets, which included Bruce Stone, of course,
Yeah.
Galway Connell, Jack Gilbert, Maxine Kumin, Donald Hall, Robert Bly, Lucille Clifton, Philip Levine. These were the folks that I interviewed for this book called Sad Friends, Drowned Lovers, Stapled Songs, which are phrases from the interviews.
It's a great title, yes.
And I just felt so, again, lucky because they all passed away about a year after, or 2 years after I did these interviews.
Yes.
And then that led me to want to do more interviews. I don't know. I always love just talking to people.
Well,
I don't know why.
we talked about this a little bit the other day, and I wonder if you could expound on that a little bit. Expound us.
I'll just tell you one story, quick
okay.
story. My father used to take me to the hospital when I was like 10, 11 on his rounds. And he'd say, I'll be right back, and he'd sit me down by the operator in the hospital, say at the Lynchburg Baptist Hospital. And she'd be there, with these, the old-fashioned board, and we'd just start talking. And I just realized I had this love of just talking to probably way too much. So I've done this now everywhere I go. I just seem to want to talk to people about and then as a therapist, that was heaven for me, because I could, I talk to people about their lives and their problems and so forth. And so that just led me to do these interviews with poets. Some of them were pretty similar to the other folks I talked to, but this was the next book I did. I Would Lie to You if I could, which was mid-career poets who I thought should be interviewed. I did another interview with Galway Connell, Carolyn Forshey, Natasha Trethewey, Annie Wright, who was James Wright's widow, Ed O'Chester, Martina Spada, Stephen Cusisto, Peter Everwine, and Stephen Sandy. And that was fun.
Did you find any commonality in those interviews?
Yeah. I mean, they all had different stories, of course.
Right.
But I think one of the comedies is what I was just talking about, that, when they write their best poems, it's the other. It's their foray into the other. If it's Carolyn Forshey, it's writing about, in her first book, or her second book, actually, The Country Between Us, about El Salvadorans, who are being slaughtered, by the fascists.
Powerful book.
Yeah. So, and with Natasha Trethewey, it was about domestic workers in New Orleans. If it was, let me see, if I was talking to Peter Everwine, who was just such a wonderful poet, it was just very straight. Well, I would just say purely his muse that transcended himself. And Jane Hirschfield, very much the other, with her Buddhist wisdom. So that was sort of the common thing.
That's so interesting, and I think that's true of artists too. Artists also, I'm sure Liz, your wife, is an artist, talk about something very similar.
She goes places that I could never dream of, in her paintings, and I'll just say, where the heck did that come from?
Right. Obviously, you carry an innate curiosity, and I think, again, it's coming to that idea that you can't pin down inspiration, where it comes from.
No. And the more I've discovered over the course, especially doing these interviews, but also in my own writing, that the more often you don't want to know about something else or someone else is exactly what you should be knowing. You should be talking about or talking to.
Yes, right. Instead of resisting, you mean.
Yeah, I discovered that in the Poet Speak here with all the different Vermont poets.
Yes.
It's like it's very easy to be intimidated, by another person's expertise or experience, but you have to break through that.
Again, you've done a lot of different things within the realm of being a poet. What's the most satisfying to you? Or what's, and I don't want to put it as just one thing, but what brings you satisfaction?
Well, I think I'd be lying if I didn't say it's the writing itself, and because I just need that constant personal confirmation, affirmation, without really knowing at the same time whether something's really any good. You know, it's like that Beckett phrase: "Fail, fail again, fail better." Um, but it, but that, but you- but knowing enough at the end of writing, you know, the 10th draft or the 15th draft, that this is working enough so that you can, you know, let it go. But I would say that's on the private creative level, which takes a huge amount of time. The one thing I regret the most is that because of the time it takes to write, you know, sometimes all day,
Yeah.
is that I don't get out enough.
Yeah. That was my next question. What do you do to clear your head?
I mean, I want to get out and just be with my neighbors more and to
Yeah.
do more sort of altruistic work. And I plan on trying to do that every year more and more.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough, I didn't mention this, but when we were first married, we lived at the Catholic Worker with Dorothy Day
Oh,
and
yeah.
got to know her very well. And she
Uh-huh.
was an enormous influence on me and Liz too. And that example is always her example, and just someone who could change your life in 5 minutes,
Oh, wow.
just talking to her
Uh-huh.
in Tivoli, New York, where we met. That her example has just been such an enormous influence in my
Yes.
life.
And it's just one's presence.
Yeah, it's
Right,
just
that does it.
she could look through you like nobody else that
Uh-huh.
I ever knew with those blue eyes. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. How do you know when a poem is completed?
It's never completed.
Good, very good answer.
It's never completed. It's let go.
Yeah.
You know, with all of its flaws. You know, like a child, it has problems still, and flaws, but you got beautiful. You know, if you feel good enough about it, or you know, worthy enough to just close the book on it. So
Yeah, and let it go.
let it go.
Let it
yeah.
go, yeah.
Mhm.
And as you say, you sometimes revisit them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's a great poem by W.S. Merwin about his teacher, John Berryman. He wanted to know the same thing. So he approaches Berryman at Princeton, where he was an undergraduate. And Berryman wrote, so Merwin wrote a poem about it, just simply called Berryman. At the end, Berryman says to Merwin, "If you have to know, stop writing." That's a great line.
Yes. Well, I think also there's something about the kinesthetic piece of having things, you know, come through your head or your heart onto the
Yeah,
page.
you really are kind of a cipher in that way. Yeah, when you're writing, I feel when you're writing your best, and you know, feeling strong enough, emotionally, psychically, to leave yourself and imagine, you know, what it's like to be someone else completely different from yourself,
Yes, right.
and find their voice.
And a lot of that also comes with being able to stare out windows, right?
Yeah, no, the window becomes a mirror and a transparency, magic sort of at the same time. I wanted to mention, you were asking, I think this has something to do with what you're, Brian Cohen, who's
Yes.
a wonderful paint artist,
Yes.
printmaker, and he asked, well, how do you get your ideas? Why do you keep writing? Well, Brian said, let's just concentrate on animals.
Uh-huh.
So he did that. He was doing these animals, these gorgeous animals that he made prints of, and there's a deer, and this just came out.
Yes.
It's called Bestiary, and.
It's a beautifully designed book.
I didn't know what he was writing. I knew that he was doing a cardinal. I knew he was doing a loon. I knew he was doing a turtle and so forth. But so I would write, you know, poems about those creatures. I've always been obsessed with animals, to the point where I wonder about it sometimes. But anyway, so we put this book together, and it just, I think, came out. We did a wonderful reading, I think, of it at the Giddings,
Mitchell-Giddings.
Mitchell-Giddings Gallery about 2 months ago. And so Brian also, who's been suffering from leukemia for the last several years and is doing better and has had remission now for. So this was an enormously meaningful book for me to do with him.
And the opening was wonderful. You got a wonderful group of people coming there to see it, and the juxtaposition of poetry and art is very powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That goes back to Putney School when we were working there
Yes.
together. You know, I was doing this book of interviews with senior poets called Sad Friends, Drowned Lovers, Staple
Yes.
Songs. Here's another more recent edition
Yes.
of it. And the last interview I did was with Ruth Stone. And I knew she didn't have much longer. She was in her early to mid 90s.
Yes.
And so I called up Nora Jacobson, the filmmaker, you know, who did the Vermont movie. And I said, you've got to get up here and film this woman. And so I said, who is she? He had never heard of her. I said, she's a great poet. Just get up here. And she got up there and started filming Ruth at her table in Ripton, Vermont, at her daughter Marcia Kroll's house. She said, I've got to make a movie of this woman. Well, to make a long story short, 13 years later,
Oh my gosh.
the film has just come out, and it's called Ruth Stone's Vast Library of the Female Mind. And now it's being shown on PBS in every single state in the country.
That's so
And it's
terrific.
won many awards. So I'm so happy for Ruth and Nora too.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I've seen this advertised. I knew that it was out. I haven't seen it yet myself. But kudos to you for getting on that.
I'm just so happy Nora said, yeah,
Yes.
we've got to film her.
Right.
So, and there's no other, I can't think of another film about an American poet that's quite like it.
That's really wonderful to hear. And I think that, that's great for everyone to hear, is that if you've got an idea, and it fires you up, whether it's sitting down and writing a poem or calling somebody and saying, oh my God, you should really check this out.
Exactly.
Go with it.
Yeah.
Go with it and follow that. Thank you, Chard.
Thank you, Wendy. It's
Thank
been
you so
wonderful.
much. Thank you for all that you've done
Wonderful
for
being
poetry.
here.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being with us today. It was great to have you with us and with Chard deNiord, who was our Poet Laureate and continues to be one of our finest poets. We are so lucky to have him, not only in the state of Vermont, but in our neighborhood. He is part of the greater Brattleboro area, as are many fabulous poets. And you might just want to take a look at his series on BCTV and check out the various poets that he has interviewed. We thank him so much for being with us today for a little conversation. Keep in mind that we're on the air pretty much every day in Brattleboro on BCTV. And check in, tune in, and be with us. We'll be back next time.